Good evening, Mr. President.
Good evening.
Happy Sunshine Week to you. Would the sponsor yield for some questions, please?
Senator Nozzolio, will you yield?
I'd be happy to yield, Mr. President.
Senator Gianaris.
Mr. President, I'd like to ask the sponsor, he mentioned in his previous conversation with Senator DeLon the total standard deviation figure, which shows 8.8%. I'd like to ask him what is the average deviation figure in this plan?
Average deviation, not, Mr. President, through you, I'm not familiar with that as a term of deviation assessment placed on those redistricting plans.
I'll be happy to explain, Mr. President.
If I may?
Yes.
The courts have clearly focused on total deviation as a criteria for legislative redistricting. The Supreme Court case of Baker versus Carr established one person, one vote. But through judicial history, there had been windows that opened primarily for other local governments and state governments. And the traditional standard deviation and total deviation allowed by our judicial system is what the focus of attention has been. The standard deviation of the current plan, to reiterate to my colleague, is 9.78%. The standard deviation of the plan proposed is 8.80%.
Mr. President, the sponsor would continue to yield.
Senator Nozzolio, will you continue to yield?
Yes, Mr. President.
I understand the total deviation number, and that represents a measure of the single most populated to the single least populated district and what the difference is between those two. I understand his answers in that regard. What I'm asking about is how off of the target number, in other words, there is a mean that all of the districts are supposed to. I'm going to wait, Mr. President, because I don't want to have to repeat my question. Okay, there is the number of 307,356 is the number each Senate district would have if they were equally populated. Now, some are higher and some are lower in this plan, and I understand that the deviation from the single highest to the single lowest is 8.8%. What I'm asking is, on average, how off of that 307,356 number are the districts in this plan?
Because that number is not a relevant number for judicial determination, I do not have that at my disposal.
If the sponsor would continue to yield, Mr. President?
Senator Nozzolio, will you continue to yield?
Yes, Mr. President.
Senator Gianaris.
I don't agree that that is not a relevant consideration for the courts. I'll be happy to provide that number for him. It is 3.67%. It is also the largest that number has ever been in the history of redistricting in this state, which means the plan that we have before us today has the largest disparity on average among districts that we have ever seen in a plan before the state. Does the sponsor not see a problem with that?
Mr. President, I stand by my previous answer.
Senator Gianaris.
If the sponsor would continue to yield.
Senator Nozzolio, will you continue to yield?
Yes, Mr. President.
Is it the sponsor's belief that it would not be possible to create a plan with a lower deviation, either total standard or average, than that which we have before us today?
Mr. President, through you, possibility is not my consideration, Mr. President. That I'm offering a plan, as the Senate is considering a plan that has a 10% improvement over the deviations that have been already accepted by a court 10 years ago.
The sponsor would again continue to yield.
Senator Nozzolio, will you continue to yield?
Yes, Mr. President.
I would suggest, Mr. President, that possibility should weigh in our minds because it is simply not acceptable to say that it is desirable to have districts that are so severely over and underpopulated one from another, because that dilutes voting strength of residents of this state. And so I would respectfully disagree. To suggest that the possibility that we can make a better plan is not relevant to the sponsor, I found outrageous and not acceptable, and something that the courts will ultimately pass judgment on. The fact is, there are possibilities of doing this better. There was a plan submitted by the group Common Cause, which had a total standard deviation of 6%, far lower than 8.8, and much lower than the 9.7 you were talking about earlier. And
Senator
their average...
Gianaris, Senator Gianaris, are you speaking on the bill, or are you asking Senator Zolio to yield to a
sir.
question?
I'm asking to yield to a question.
Thank you.
I would like to continue with stating the premise of my question. That Common Cause plan not only has a drastically lower standard total deviation, but also has a drastically lower average deviation of 1.5%. Now, does the sponsor not think that if we could make a plan that's better, that creates the districts with more equal population than that's before us today, that would not be desirable?
Mr. President, of course, I would love to see a better plan. Of course, I would like to see Senator Gianaris happy. He may consider a better plan that we put forward. The second draft, I think Senator Gianaris may have liked a lot better than the first draft that we put forward. The fact of the matter is, we're dealing in the reality, and I would like to see a better plan for a lot of different issues before this legislature. This is an issue, though, that we have to deal with the decisions of the courts. Decisions of the courts focus on standard deviation, not what would be a better possible deviation. That, in fact, this deviation was a deviation that is well accepted within the judicial standards. It is a deviation that improves over the last deviation, and that I believe it's a success of this plan to have a lesser standard deviation as required, and I think the court will say you did a better job than was done in the last redistricting by the improvement of the standard deviation, which is the standard test for judicial review on this subject.
Mr. President, the sponsor would continue to yield.
Senator Zolio, will you continue to yield?
Yes, Mr. President.
Senator Gianaris.
I would ask the sponsor, is the standard to which he's holding himself to do the bare minimum legally acceptable that would be passed on by the courts, or to do something that's in the best interest of the people by establishing a plan that has more equal population among the districts and less of a deviation? Because it seems like every answer is about what the courts would accept, not what necessarily would make good policy.
On the contrary, Mr. President, maybe Senator Gianaris wasn't paying attention to the comments I made earlier, focusing on, let me reiterate some of those, that I'm very proud of what this proposal does in establishing a new minority district in the Asian community, not too far from the district that Senator Gianaris now represents, the first other Asian American Senate minority majority district in New York State. Of the 13 minority districts in New York State, 5 of them were below the 50% level as a result of shifting population in New York State. And this plan restores their minority representation status. That was something that we worked very hard to achieve. The cores of existing districts are something that is a constitutionally accepted and required principle in redistricting. And we established over 70% of the districts proposed by this plan have at least 70% of the core of their existing district as established. We're trying to push and establish the best possible plan, the most transparent plan, the most citizen inputted plan possible, and that I think that the proof is in the demographics, and those demographics are that we have taken, in spite of declining populations in many areas of the state, we have improved those districts that are essentially minority districts, and we have focused on improving standard deviations, and we have focused on improving the numbers of cores of existing districts. Each of those items we have improved upon past work.
If the sponsor will continue to yield, Mr. President.
Senator Nozzolio, will you continue to yield?
Yes, Mr. President.
Senator Gianaris.
How many districts in the plan before us deviate by more than 4% from the mean?
Mr. President, I don't have that number in front of me. I'd be glad to provide it to Senator Gianaris in the future.
If the sponsor would continue to yield, Mr. President.
Senator Nozzolio, will you continue to yield?
Yes, Mr. President.
I'd be happy to provide him with that number. The answer is 23. 23, more than 1/3 of the Senate districts deviate from the mean by more than 4%. Compared to the map that we're living under today, which has only 7 districts deviating from that mean by more than 4%. Which brings me back to my original point. My question to the sponsor is, does it not disturb him? Never mind the total deviation, which went from 9.7 to 8.8, but does it not disturb him that we're not measuring one district against another? We're measuring all 62 or 63 districts against what the number should be, and we have escalated that number to historic proportions. Historic proportions, the number of our districts that deviate from the mean number by more than 4% is the highest it has ever been in recorded history. Does that not disturb the sponsor? Does that not make this plan unfair?
Mr. President, that the districts proposed are well within the standard deviations required by the courts. The districts proposed improve the standard deviation record of those districts currently held in the New York State Senate. The plan proposed today has a standard deviation of 8.80%. That deviation is a 10% improvement over the 9.78% standard deviation accepted by the courts 10 years ago.
If the sponsor will continue to yield, Mr. President.
Senator Nozzolio, will you continue to yield?
Yes, Mr. President.
I'd like to attempt to get my question answered in a way that maybe provides a bit of focus and example for everyone listening. Can the sponsor tell me what is the population of the 10 districts that have the most white population by race in this plan? And I'll be happy to provide the answer if he doesn't have it available.
Excuse me, Senator Gianaris, are you asking him a question, or you just said you're going to provide that information?
Well, in my previous questions, he has not had the answer available. I happen to have the answer here, so I was hoping to have him give me the answer as he understands it to see if it conforms to my numbers, but I'll be happy to provide it if he doesn't have it.
I couldn't determine what Senator Gianaris' question is. Could he please repeat it?
I'll be happy to. If we take a ranking of the districts by racial component, and we take the 10 districts that have the highest white population in them and add up the total population of those districts in this plan, what is that number?
It would take me a number of minutes, Mr. President, to go through the books that were provided to our members, that these books have that information in it, and Senator Gianaris is welcome to review them. That data, that is part of the submissions put forward by LATFOR, and that I'm sure that question can be answered with a simple calculator and some mathematical time to review.
Mr. President, the sponsor will continue to yield.
Senator Nozzolio, will you continue to yield?
Yes, Mr. President.
I have, in fact, done those calculations, so let me cut to the chase of my question. It turns out that the 10 most white districts in this plan have a population of 2,924,968. By contrast, the 9 most African-American districts in this plan have a population of 2,864,372. Those numbers are roughly equal. There's a difference of 2% between them. does it not disturb, not just the sponsor, but this entire majority, that this plan says that African American communities are deserving of only 9 senators for every 10 senators that the white communities in this state have? Is that not shameful to the sponsor?
Mr. President, we're very proud of the fact that this body has continued to support the establishment of minority-majority districts. I already mentioned 10 years ago when this body established a Hispanic district in Queens. The 13 minority state Senate districts, of those 13, 5 had a population of less than 50%. That this LAT4 and this Senate has taken a very proactive role in restoring and protecting and preserving those minority districts. The 5 of which, because of shifting population in the city of New York, had a considerable concern falling below the 50% minority, and that we've restored, protected, and preserved those districts. That's the focus of LAT4, and that I'm very proud of that focus.
If the sponsor would continue to yield, Mr. President.
Senator Zolio, will you continue to yield?
Yes, Mr. President.
Senator Gianaris.
Is the sponsor familiar with the term packing as it relates to redistricting?
Mr. President, I would certainly welcome Senator Gianaris' definition of such term.
If the sponsor would continue to yield.
Senator Zolio, will you continue to yield?
Yes, Mr. President.
The term packing is a notorious and common method of disenfranchisement of minority communities by loading up as many people of color into as few districts as possible to deny them additional representatives. So when the sponsor tells me that they've increased the numbers of people of color in certain districts, that is not something to be applauded when they are already represented by people of color, because what they're doing is denying the surrounding communities the same benefit. And that is made evident by the fact that there's roughly the same number of people of color represented by 9 senators and the same number of people who are Caucasian represented by 10 senators. And that is an unprecedented outrage. And that is what packing is, to answer Senator Zolio's question. And it is going on rampantly in the plan that's before us today. And when we talk about population deviation, that is the real effect it's having on the streets of New York. That you're disenfranchising communities of color from Erie County to Suffolk and everywhere in between by making sure that those communities have higher populations in those Senate districts than other communities in this state.
Senator Gianaris, are you speaking on the bill, or are you asking Senator Zolio to yield to a question?
I am asking the senator to yield to a question, Mr. President.
Thank you.
And the question is, have you no shame, Senator Zolio? Have you no shame to produce a plan that disenfranchises so blatantly communities of color throughout this state? And please don't give me your talking points again. I've heard them several times.
Senator Gianaris.
Yes, sir.
I would remind everyone in the chamber that the House being in order and having a sense of decorum is really a good thing for everybody. We've been doing pretty well up until this point, Senator Dilan having set the appropriate tone. I would remind you as well that Senator Zolio has engaged you and listened to your questions, and he is entitled to answer those questions as he deems fit. If he doesn't answer them to your liking, he is entitled to answer the questions the way he deems appropriate.
I don't believe, Mr. President, that I have taken issue with the way he's answered any of my questions.
Senator Gianaris, you just said you don't want to hear any of his talking points, so I'm just reminding you that if he is going to speak to your questions, he is entitled to answer them the way he deems fit.
Point taken, Mr. President.
Thank you, Mr. President, and I'd like to respond to Senator Gianaris' question directly. Senator Gianaris should know that I am not in any way, shape, or form ashamed of this plan. Frankly, the question was insulting. I am very proud of this plan. I am very proud of the fact that we have fully complied with all tenets of the Federal Voting Rights Act, that we have restored 5 majority-minority districts in this state and within the covered counties of this state, even though those 5 districts fell below 50%. Senator Gianaris' definition of packing, I think, is totally inappropriate, totally beyond the formal, judicially termed definitions of packing, and that this plan does not engage in such behavior. This plan is totally within the tenets of the Federal Voting Rights Act, and I am, in fact, proud of the job that has been done in establishing minority rights in this state Senate and minority districts in this state Senate.
Thank you, Senator Zolio. If the sponsor will continue to yield.
Senator Zolio, will you continue to yield?
Yes, Mr. President.
Thank you. I'd like to move on to a different topic now, the question of the 63rd seat. Would the sponsor be willing to stipulate that the purpose of the constitutional provision that determines the size of the Senate exists so that when the population of the state grows in a certain region, that region does not end up taking a senator from another part of the state? In other words, was it not a compromise in 1894 to deal with counties that had growing populations so that we wouldn't have senators shifted? And the idea would be those counties would gain an extra senator by increasing the size of the Senate, and other counties would maintain their position.
Mr. President, please advise Senator Gianaris that I would no way stipulate to such a definition.
Senator Gianaris.
If the sponsor will continue to yield, Mr. President.
Senator Zolio, will you continue to yield?
Yes, Mr. President.
Well, historical records certainly seem to make that point, regardless of whether the sponsor stipulates to it or not. I'd ask the question as a matter of policy. If we are going to make a determination that the Senate size should change and grow by 1, does it not make sense for that district to be placed in the parts of the state that have experienced the greatest growth in the last decade?
Mr. President, I believe that it is a decision of this body as it accepts the establishment of the 63rd seat, that seat is in fact placed in one of the fastest growing regions of the state. The Hudson Valley has historically been one of the fastest growing regions, that this district winds through the Hudson Valley and in fact is one of the fastest growing population centers in this state. That this plan reflects that growth, and that the addition of the Senate seat is a reflection of that growth.
If the sponsor will continue to yield, Mr. President.
Senator Zolio, will you continue to yield?
Yes, Mr. President.
Senator Gianaris.
While it may be true that the Hudson Valley has experienced growth, the numbers make clear that it's in the lower Hudson Valley where that growth has been experienced. Counties of Orange and Putnam and Westchester and Rockland. This new district that's being proposed doesn't touch any of those districts. It is in the capital region and in the northern Hudson Valley. So again, I ask, would it not make sense to place a new district where the population growth was the greatest?
Mr. President, I think Senator Gianaris' atlas could use the addition of a few more counties. Saratoga County is by far one of the fastest growing counties. I believe it is the fastest growing county in the state of New York.
If the sponsor will continue to yield, Mr. President.
Senator Zolio, will you continue to yield?
Yes, Mr. President.
Senator Gianaris.
How much of Saratoga County is located in the new 46th district?
Mr. President, 46th district, the counties are outlined here. That Saratoga County is not a component of the 63rd senatorial district.
If the sponsor will continue to yield, Mr. President.
However, if I may, Mr. President,
Senator Zolio.
that no district is created in a vacuum, that each district relies on population centers around it, as well as within it, and that the inclusion of this district in the region from extending from the lower Hudson into the capital region is part of a growth that extends from the lower Hudson into the capital region. Districts around the 63rd seat are as relevant to its establishment as the growth rate within that 63rd seat.
Continue to yield.
Senator Zolio, will you continue to yield?
Yes, Mr. President.
Senator Gianaris.
I'd like to move on to an area that's a little bit complicated to discuss. It took me quite a while to grasp it, but I do want to get into this formula in the Constitution for determining whether or not the Senate size should increase and how it was applied in this plan. Can the sponsor explain briefly how it is that the Constitution provides a formula, what the formula is in the Constitution for determining the size of the Senate?
I'd refer Senator Gianaris first to Article 3, Section 4 of the state constitution. Also, I would refer him to the memo presented on the LAT4 website by counsel. I would also refer to Senator Gianaris the applicable sites cited in counsel's memo for further explanation on those judicial opinions relevant to this issue.
Continue to yield, Mr. President.
Senator Zolio, will you continue to yield?
Yes, Mr. President.
I appreciate the sponsor's response to that question, but I think it's important because I submit that the formula was misapplied in an unconstitutional manner, so I think it's important that we get into a conversation about what that formula is and how it was applied in this case. Now, as I understand it, we're dealing with a provision in Article 3, Section 4 that was written in 1894 and provides that when certain counties that are larger in this state experience growth, there's a formula applied to determine whether they are entitled to what the Constitution calls an additional share or an additional senator for purposes of this formula. Is that in conformance with what the sponsor believes as well?
Mr. President, I believe it was very difficult to follow Senator Gianaris on his trail in trying to frame a question. Not to be critical of Mr. Gianaris, but I believe the Senator tried to ask a question. I really didn't gather one out of that statement. Could he be so kind as to repeat the question, or at least rephrase it in the form of a question?
I will be happy to. And excuse my lack of articulateness in that question, Senator. Would you agree that Article 3, Section 4 provides a formula to determine when certain large counties in this state experience enough growth to justify an additional senator?
Mr. President, it's my understanding that the Constitution sets forward in motion the establishment of a process, and that the formula has actually been determined by a number of judicial decisions. Those decisions are the part of a council's opinion that has been on the LAT4 website for a number of months. I again refer Senator to that opinion by counsel. One need only go to the LAT4 website to find it.
Would the sponsor continue to yield, Mr. President?
Senator
Yes.
Zolio, will you continue to yield?
Yes, Mr. President.
Senator Gianaris.
With all due respect, is the sponsor aware that his counsel doesn't get a vote in this chamber? And we are called upon to apply our judgment to what is proper and improper. And this is an important issue, of constitutional interpretation and what the size of our representative government should be in this state. So with respect, it's not sufficient for me for someone to say, waive a council's memo and say this is the answer. I would like to engage in a conversation about this formula and how it was applied here.
Senator Gianaris, are you asking, it seems to me you were commenting and questioning. What, can you restate exactly what your question is for Senator Zolio?
My question is the sponsor aware that his counsel is called upon to give advice that would then be interpreted by him and his colleagues, not to actually cast a determinative vote in how we do a redistricting plan?
Mr. President, of course, the council's advice is just that. It's advice. That advice was, in fact, from this identical council that provided the advice to the Senate 10 years ago. That advice then was upheld by the appropriate courts. The advice has a great deal of credibility, a great deal of success, and that council's memo in recognizing and recommending similar action this year, I believe, is headed towards a similar result of the courts accepting the council's analysis of this constitutional required provision.
If the sponsor would continue to yield, Mr. President.
Senator Zolio, will you continue to yield?
Yes, Mr. President.
Senator Gianaris.
Mr. President, I'd like to ask the sponsor how he knows that the advice given by counsel 10 years ago is the same as the advice he gave this year.
Very good question, Mr. President. The memo provided on the LAT4 website incorporates the memo that the council provided 10 years ago. That there were a combination of the advice through the memo presented 10 years ago with the analysis updated based on the assessments today, incorporated with that memo from 10 years ago.
If the sponsor would continue to yield, Mr.
Senator
President.
Zolio, will you continue to yield?
Yes, Mr. President.
Senator Gianaris.
Is the sponsor aware that there were two different methodologies used in two different parts of the state in making the determination that this plan should go to 63 senators?
I don't believe that the contention by Senator Gianaris is accurate.
If the sponsor would continue to yield, Mr.
Senator
President.
Zolio, will you continue to yield?
Yes, Mr. President.
Senator Gianaris.
Is the sponsor not aware that his own counsel, who he's using as the authority, readily admits that there were two different methodologies used in two different parts of the state in this plan?
Let me try to clear up Senator Gianaris' confusion, Mr. President, with this response. That council's memo provides two alternative paths to basically reach, that both basically reach the same conclusion. That there are, the analysis intention is to be comprehensive, and that's why the council looked at both alternatives as potentials, and that both alternatives led to the very same conclusion, that a 63rd seat is in fact constitutionally sound and required for this next redistricting.
If the sponsor would continue to yield, Mr. President.
Senator
Zolio, will you continue to yield?
Yes, Mr. President.
Senator Gianaris.
Is the sponsor not aware that what actually happened was both of those alternatives were applied simultaneously in the same plan, and that is the only way that the formula resulted in 63?
Mr. President, Senator Gianaris is certainly entitled to his own opinion and his assessment of council's memo. I believe I have demonstrated my opinion of council's memo. I stand by those previous answers.
Mr. President, on the bill, please.
Senator Gianaris on the bill.
I find, it's not a surprise to anyone in this chamber that I find this bill woefully inadequate. And I've heard contentions that, I want to make sure I get the terms right, it was fair and legal and complies with the state constitution, the U.S. Constitution, and the Voting Rights Act. The fact is, this plan is none of those things. It is not fair, it is not legal, it violates the state constitution in determining the size of the Senate, it violates the U.S. Constitution in applying the one-person, one-vote rule, and it violates the Voting Rights Act in numerous counties throughout this state, most notably in Hempstead, in Nassau County. Yet we plod on, and we use as authority a council's memo that no one seems able to explain. Makes me wonder whether the council was told, get us to 63, please, and I don't care how you get there, but get us there because that's the number that works for us politically. In fact, 10 years ago, we have memoranda written by this same majority that said exactly that in your path to get to 62 from 61. So if there's anyone here who would like to get up and have a conversation about how this formula was applied and how you got to 63, I'd love to have it because I have a pretty good idea of how it was, and I'm pretty confident it was applied illegally. Yet there's no one here who seems able to explain it other than referring back to a council's memo. Not only a council's memo from the previous year, but from 10 years prior. The fact that we're debating such an important piece of legislation at 11 o'clock at night and can't even have a substantive conversation about it speaks volumes about the depths we fall into in this chamber as we're doing something as important as determining the districts under which people get to vote for their representatives. We're sitting here with the highest average deviation in history of this state that we're proposing, in history. We're sitting here increasing the size of the Senate, placing a new district that is uncalled for in a part of the state that has not experienced the highest growth. It is an exercise in cynicism, the likes of which I haven't seen in 12 years in the state legislature. There's been talk about a new era in Albany, how well things are functioning. Well, so much for change coming to Albany. As we sit here today in the middle of the night, in the middle of Sunshine Week, talking about a blatantly illegal plan that disenfranchises millions of New Yorkers. It's fun to be petty with these lines. It's fun to make jokes about them. And I know the sponsor made reference to the previous plan, the originally proposed plan in January 26th, and the second plan, and how I might like one better than the other. Fact is, these two plans are virtually identical. If you look at the number of census blocks actually changed from one plan to another, it was more than 98% exactly the same. And I know what the sponsor was referring to, about where I live and what my district was going to be. But as far as I'm concerned, you could take the second plan, put it together with the first plan, and shove it with both of them. Thank you, Mr. President.